The torpedo hits the target. The crew hears the impact echo through the hull. They wait for the explosion that will tear the enemy's ship apart. Silence. The Japanese warship continues forward, untouched, unaware it was just struck by a weapon that refused to work. The submarine dives deep, carrying men who just learned their primary weapon is worthless. This happens in December 1941, days after Pearl Harbor, when America can least afford a single failure. But this isn't mechanical bad luck. This isn't a defect that surprised anyone. The Mark 14 torpedo had problems before the war even started, and somewhere in the Navy's chain of command, someone knew. They knew the tests were incomplete. They knew the weapon was unproven. They sent it to war anyway. How many men died waiting for a torpedo that was never going to explode? How many enemy ships escaped because the Navy decided thorough testing cost too much? And if they were willing to gamble with this, what else did they send to the Pacific that they knew was broken? December 1941, somewhere in the Pacific, a U.S. submarine tracks a Japanese destroyer through the crosshairs of its periscope. The captain has maneuvered into perfect position, risking detection, risking depth charges, risking everything for this one clean shot. The war is days old, and this is what they trained for. This is why submarines exist. The crew is silent, watching their commander's hand signals, waiting for the order that will send America's most sophisticated weapon into the side of an enemy warship. The torpedoes launch. The submarine shakes with each release. 4 Mark 14 torpedoes, each one packed with 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, each one guided by gyroscopes and driven by steam turbines, raced toward the target at 46 knots. The crew counts seconds, calculating distance and speed in their heads, knowing exactly when impact should occur. They hear it. The distinct metallic thud of a torpedo striking steel hull reverberates through the water. Then another. 2 solid hits. The crew braces for the shock wave that should follow, the explosion that should crack the destroyer's spine and send it to the bottom. Nothing comes. The destroyer's propellers continue their steady rhythm. Its silhouette doesn't change. It doesn't slow, doesn't list, doesn't show any sign of damage. It simply steams away, completely unaware that it just survived a perfect attack. The captain orders the periscope down. The submarine goes deep, running silent, because now they're in enemy waters with 2 fewer torpedoes and nothing to show for it. The crew doesn't speak. They don't need to. Everyone just watched their primary weapon fail at the moment it mattered most. This wasn't a miss. This wasn't an operator error. The torpedoes ran true, struck the target, and refused to explode. In the control room, men who spent years training for this moment now face a war where their weapons are nothing more than expensive paperweights. The captain writes it in his patrol report: direct hits, no explosions. He doesn't know yet that his report will join dozens of others saying the exact same thing. He doesn't know that submarine commanders across the Pacific are experiencing identical failures. He doesn't know that the weapon the Navy spent years developing and millions of dollars perfecting is fundamentally, catastrophically broken. All he knows is that he just wasted 2 torpedoes and let an enemy warship escape, and somewhere up the chain of command, someone is going to read his report and do absolutely nothing about it. The submarine returns to Pearl Harbor weeks later, having fired multiple torpedoes with minimal results. The crew unloads, restocks, and prepares to go back out with the same weapon that just failed them repeatedly. No modifications are made. No replacements are issued. No explanations are given. The Mark 14 torpedo is declared operational and ready for combat, and the next submarine leaves port carrying the same duds that the last one brought back. This is December 1941, and America is losing a war it doesn't even know it's losing, not because the enemy is better, but because the Navy sent men into combat with weapons designed to fail. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to change everything. For nearly 2 decades, the Navy poured resources into creating a weapon that would make American submarines the most lethal force in any ocean. This wasn't just another torpedo. This was the culmination of years of research, engineering innovation, and tactical doctrine that placed the submarine at the center of America's Pacific strategy. The Mark 14 represented a philosophical shift in naval warfare, a weapon designed not just to damage enemy ships but to destroy them with a single hit. Every submarine commander who trained with it, every crew member who loaded it into torpedo tubes, every admiral who planned Pacific operations believed they possessed a decisive technological advantage that would offset Japan's numerical superiority in surface vessels. The Mark 14 was the weapon that would win the war before it really started. The torpedo's most revolutionary feature was its Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, a device so sophisticated and so secret that submarine crews weren't allowed to examine it or even understand how it worked. The magnetic exploder was designed to detonate the torpedo without making physical contact with the target. It would sense the change in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull passing overhead, then trigger the warhead to explode directly beneath the keel, where the ship was most vulnerable. This wasn't just clever engineering. This was a way to break a warship's back, to snap it in half with a single underwater detonation that would send even the largest battleship to the bottom in minutes. Traditional torpedoes had to strike the armored side of a ship, where thick steel plating could absorb or deflect the blast. The Mark 14 would bypass all of that, hitting where armor couldn't protect, where a single explosion could create catastrophic structural failure. On paper, it was brilliant. In war games and planning scenarios, it was unstoppable. The Navy had created a weapon that could theoretically sink any ship afloat with one shot. Beyond the magnetic exploder, the Mark 14 incorporated depth control technology that allowed it to run at precise depths beneath the surface, staying hidden from visual detection while approaching its target. The torpedo could be set to run at any depth up to 40 feet, passing undetected beneath a ship's waterline until a magnetic exploder sensed the target's hull and triggered detonation. This combination of stealth and precision made the Mark 14 the ultimate submarine weapon, a technological marvel that represented everything American engineering could achieve when properly funded and prioritized. Submarine commanders trained for years on the tactical doctrine built around this weapon. They learned to calculate firing solutions that accounted for the torpedo's speed, the target's course and speed, and the precise depth setting that would position the warhead directly beneath the enemy's keel. They practiced approach angles and attack positions designed to maximize the magnetic exploder's effectiveness. The entire submarine warfare strategy for the Pacific was built on the assumption that the Mark 14 would perform exactly as designed. The Navy's confidence in the Mark 14 wasn't baseless optimism. The torpedo had undergone years of development and testing. Engineers had solved complex problems related to propulsion, guidance, and depth control. The magnetic exploder itself was a masterpiece of miniaturized technology, sensitive enough to detect minute changes in magnetic fields, while robust enough to withstand the shock and vibration of launch and high-speed underwater travel. Pre-war tests showed promising results. Torpedoes ran at proper depths. Magnetic exploders functioned under controlled conditions. The weapon appeared to work exactly as intended, and that appearance was enough to declare it combat-ready. Submarine commanders received their Mark 14 torpedoes with full confidence that they possessed a weapon superior to anything the Japanese Navy could field. They believed that when war came, American submarines would dominate the Pacific not through numbers or brute force but through technological superiority. They believed the Mark 14 would make every submarine a capital ship killer, capable of taking on destroyers, cruisers, and battleships with equal effectiveness. They believed they had been given the perfect weapon. What they actually received was something else entirely. The Mark 14 that went to war in December 1941 was a weapon that had never been fully tested under real combat conditions. It had never been fired with a live warhead at an actual target. The magnetic exploder had never been tested against real ships moving at combat speeds in real ocean conditions with varying magnetic fields. The depth control system had never been verified to work properly when the torpedo was loaded with a full combat warhead instead of an exercise head. The Navy had created an extraordinarily sophisticated weapon based on theoretical performance and limited testing, then declared it ready for war without ever confirming that theory matched reality. Submarine commanders didn't know this. Crews didn't know this. They went into combat believing they had been given the best torpedo in the world, and that belief would cost them dearly in the months ahead. The reports start arriving at Pearl Harbor within weeks of the war's beginning, each one describing the same impossible situation in slightly different words. USS Swordfish fires torpedoes at a Japanese freighter, hears impacts, watches the target sail away undamaged. USS Sea Dragon gets a perfect shot at a tanker, sees the torpedo wakes run true and strike the hull, counts the seconds waiting for an explosion that never comes. USS Pompano ambushes a convoy, fires a full spread of 6 torpedoes at point-blank range, and achieves nothing but the sound of metal hitting metal without detonation. These aren't isolated incidents scattered across months of operations. These are happening simultaneously across thousands of miles of ocean to different submarines with different crews firing at different targets under different conditions. The only constant is the Mark 14 torpedo, and the only consistent result is failure. Submarine commanders begin adapting their tactics, trying to compensate for a weapon they don't understand. Some start firing larger spreads, reasoning that if individual torpedoes won't explode, volume might overcome the problem. Others move closer to their targets, risking detection and counterattack to ensure solid hits. A few begin experimenting with depth settings, adjusting the torpedoes to run shallower or deeper, hoping to stumble onto whatever combination might actually produce an explosion. Nothing works consistently. A submarine might achieve a successful detonation on one patrol, giving the crew hope that they've solved the problem, then experience complete failure on the next patrol using identical settings against a similar target. There's no pattern the crews can identify, no adjustment that reliably improves performance. The Mark 14 works when it wants to and fails without explanation, turning every attack into a gamble where the odds are heavily stacked against success. The USS Skipjack encounters a Japanese aircraft carrier in January 1942, the kind of target that submarine commanders dream about, the kind of opportunity that could change the course of a battle or even a campaign. The captain maneuvers into perfect position, calculating a firing solution that accounts for the carrier's speed and course, setting the torpedoes to run at the precise depth that should position them directly beneath the carrier's massive hull. He fires 4 Mark 14s in a carefully timed sequence designed to ensure at least one hit regardless of the carrier's evasive maneuvers. The torpedoes run hot and true, disappearing into the water on courses that should intersect the carrier's path with mathematical certainty. The crew waits in silence, knowing they've just done everything correctly, knowing this shot should work. They hear what sounds like detonations in the distance, faint thumps that could be torpedoes exploding, or it could be something else entirely. Through the periscope, the carrier continues steaming forward, unchanged, undamaged, completely unaffected by an attack that should have sent it to the bottom. The captain dives deep and withdraws, having just wasted 4 torpedoes and lost a chance to eliminate a major Japanese capital ship. By March 1942, the pattern is undeniable to anyone reading patrol reports. Submarines are making successful attacks, achieving textbook firing solutions, putting torpedoes on target, and getting nothing in return except wasted weapons and missed opportunities. The USS Tarpon fires 13 torpedoes during a single patrol and achieves exactly 1 confirmed sinking. The USS Stingray expends 16 torpedoes over multiple attacks and damages 2 ships without sinking either one. The USS Tuna fires 19 torpedoes at various targets and records 3 definite hits, 0 sinking, and a growing sense among the crew that they're being sent into combat with defective equipment. These aren't training exercises where failure means embarrassment and a chance to try again. These are combat operations where failure means enemy ships continue operating, enemy supplies reach their destinations, and enemy forces remain at full strength because American torpedoes refuse to explode. Every dud represents a lost opportunity that won't come again, a perfect shot wasted, a tactical advantage thrown away because the weapon doesn't work. Submarine commanders begin expressing frustration in their patrol reports, carefully worded complaints that hint at systemic problems without directly accusing the Navy of sending them to war with broken weapons. They describe textbook attacks that produce no results. They note the sound of torpedoes striking targets without subsequent explosions. They request permission to experiment with different depth settings or to deactivate the magnetic exploder and rely solely on contact detonation. Some of these requests are granted. Most are denied or ignored. The official position remains that the Mark 14 is functioning as designed and that any failures must be attributable to crew error, improper maintenance, or unrealistic expectations about torpedo performance under combat conditions. Submarine commanders know better. Their crews know better. But knowing the weapon is broken and getting someone to fix it are 2 entirely different things. The problems with the Mark 14 didn't begin in December 1941. They began years earlier in peacetime, when the consequences of failure were measured in wasted test shots rather than lost lives. The Bureau of Ordnance conducted limited trials of the Mark 14 throughout the 1930s, firing exercise torpedoes at stationary targets and moving vessels to verify basic functionality. These tests revealed issues almost immediately. Torpedoes ran deeper than their set depths. The magnetic exploder showed inconsistent performance in different ocean conditions. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely. Others failed to detonate at all. The test data accumulated in reports and files, documenting problems that should have triggered extensive additional testing and design modifications. Instead, the Bureau of Ordnance made minor adjustments, declared the issues resolved, and moved forward with production. The fundamental problems were never addressed because addressing them properly would have required something the Navy wasn't willing to provide: live-fire testing with actual warheads against real targets. Live warheads were expensive. Each Mark 14 torpedo cost roughly $10,000 in 1940s money, and the explosive filling represented a significant portion of that cost. Firing them at target ships in peacetime tests meant destroying valuable ordnance that could be stored for wartime use. The Navy decided that the cost of comprehensive live-fire testing outweighed the potential benefits. They would verify the torpedo's basic functionality with exercise heads, trust the engineering calculations that said live warheads would perform identically, and save the actual combat torpedoes for actual combat. This decision was based on budget constraints and institutional assumptions about the reliability of American engineering. It was also based on the belief that any problems discovered in combat could be quickly identified and resolved through field modifications. What the Navy failed to consider was that discovering problems in combat meant discovering them at the worst possible time, under the worst possible conditions, with lives depending on weapons that didn't work. Captain submarines and experienced officers raised concerns about the limited testing. They questioned whether exercise torpedoes with dummy warheads truly replicated the performance of combat torpedoes loaded with 600 pounds of high explosive. They pointed out that the additional weight of a live warhead would affect the torpedo's buoyancy and depth control. They noted that the magnetic exploder had never been tested under realistic combat conditions against actual warships with varying magnetic signatures. These concerns were documented in official correspondence and technical reports. Some officers pushed for more extensive testing programs. A few suggested that the Mark 14 should not be declared fully operational until it had proven itself in live-fire trials against decommissioned ships or capture vessels. The Bureau of Ordnance acknowledged these concerns, then proceeded to ignore them. The Mark 14 was declared combat-ready based on theoretical performance and limited exercise testing, and production continued at full capacity to stockpile torpedoes for the war everyone knew was coming. The magnetic exploder presented particularly troubling warning signs. The device was so secret that even submarine commanders weren't allowed to fully understand its mechanism or perform detailed inspections. This secrecy was justified by fears that the technology might fall into enemy hands if a submarine was captured or sunk in shallow water. But secrecy also meant that problems with the exploder were difficult to diagnose and impossible to fix in the field. Pre-war tests showed that the magnetic exploder's performance varied depending on the Earth's magnetic field at different latitudes. A setting that worked perfectly in the North Atlantic might fail completely in the South Pacific. The exploder was also sensitive to the magnetic signature of the target ship itself, which varied based on the ship's construction, cargo, and even which direction it was heading relative to magnetic north. These variables were known before the war started. They were documented in technical reports. They should have triggered extensive testing across different ocean regions and against different types of vessels. Instead, the Bureau of Ordnance assumed that minor calibration adjustments would compensate for these variables, and the magnetic exploder went to war without ever being proven under realistic conditions. By 1941, the Mark 14 torpedo existed in a peculiar state of official perfection and documented unreliability. On paper, it was the most sophisticated torpedo in the world, a weapon that represented the pinnacle of American naval technology. In reality, it was a device that had never been comprehensively tested and had shown troubling signs of malfunction during the limited tests it had undergone. The Navy chose to believe the paper version. They chose to trust engineering calculations over empirical evidence. They chose to save money on live-fire testing rather than verify that their primary submarine weapon actually worked as designed. When war came in December 1941, American submarines went into combat carrying torpedoes that had essentially never been proven, and the men firing them had no idea they were gambling with weapons that the Navy had never bothered to fully test. The warnings had been there. The concerns had been raised. The problems had been documented. And every single one of those warnings had been filed away and forgotten because fixing them would have cost money and time that the Navy decided it couldn't spare. The men in American submarines didn't have the luxury of waiting for the Navy to fix its mistakes. They went back to sea patrol after patrol, knowing their primary weapon was unreliable, knowing that every attack was a gamble, knowing that the enemy ships they failed to sink would come back to kill other Americans. The psychological weight of fighting with broken weapons is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Submarine crews operated under constant stress, even in the best circumstances, sealed inside steel tubes hundreds of feet beneath the surface, hunted by destroyers and aircraft, breathing recycled air and eating canned food while knowing that a single mistake or mechanical failure could kill everyone aboard. Achieved a perfect attack position after days or weeks of searching. After taking enormous risks to close within torpedo range, their weapons might simply refuse to work. Every failed attack wasn't just a tactical disappointment. It was a confirmation that they were being asked to fight a war with one hand tied behind their backs. USS Growler's crew experienced this reality in brutal fashion during a patrol in early 1942. Commander Howard Gilmore maneuvered his submarine into attack position against a Japanese convoy, achieving the kind of tactical setup that submarine commanders practice for years to perfect. Multiple targets, overlapping firing solutions, enough torpedoes loaded to engage several ships in rapid succession. This was the scenario where American submarines were supposed to dominate, where superior technology and training would devastate enemy logistics. Gilmore fired a full spread of torpedoes at the closest freighter, then immediately prepared to engage the next target. The first torpedoes struck the freighter's hull with audible impacts. The crew heard them hit. They waited for the explosions that would break the freighter apart and send the convoy into chaos. Nothing happened. The freighter continued forward, apparently undamaged, while the escorts began searching for the submarine that had just revealed its position. Gilmore had to break off the attack and go deep, having accomplished nothing except alerting the enemy to his presence and wasting 6 torpedoes that represented weeks of patrol endurance. The convoy escaped. The supplies it carried reached Japanese forces. And somewhere in the Pacific, American soldiers and Marines would face an enemy that remained well supplied because a submarine crew did everything right and their torpedoes did nothing at all. The failures accumulated into a grotesque arithmetic of lost opportunities. Every torpedo that didn't explode represented not just a wasted shot, but a compounding series of consequences that rippled outward across the war. A transport ship that should have been sunk delivers reinforcements to a contested island. A tanker that should have been destroyed keeps enemy aircraft flying and enemy ships steaming. A destroyer that should have been eliminated continues hunting American submarines, forcing them to remain submerged and defensive when they should be hunting aggressively. The strategic calculus of submarine warfare depends on submarines being able to sink more tonnage than the enemy can replace. When torpedoes don't work, that calculus inverts. Submarines become resource consumers rather than force multipliers, burning fuel and supplies and crew endurance to achieve minimal results, while the enemy continues operating at near full capacity. The Mark 14's failure wasn't just embarrassing or frustrating. It was actively extending the war by allowing the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine to operate with far less attrition than American strategy assumed they would suffer. Submarine crews began developing dark superstitions about the Mark 14, treating it like an unpredictable animal that might work or might not depending on factors no one could identify or control. Some crews painted good luck symbols on torpedo casings. Others performed elaborate pre-firing checks that went far beyond official procedures, looking for any mechanical issue that might explain why some torpedoes worked and others didn't. A few submarines reported that torpedoes seemed to work better in certain sea conditions or at certain depths, though no one could establish a reliable pattern. This was men trying to impose order on chaos, trying to find some element of control over a weapon that seemed to have a mind of its own. The reality was simpler and more disturbing. The Mark 14 was fundamentally flawed in multiple ways, and no amount of crew diligence or tactical brilliance could compensate for weapons that the Navy had never properly tested. The human cost extended beyond missed opportunities and strategic failures. Submarine commanders took increasingly desperate risks trying to compensate for torpedo unreliability. They closed to point-blank range, where the chance of being detected and counterattacked increased dramatically, but where they could be certain their torpedoes would at least hit the target. They fired larger spreads, expending precious torpedoes at wasteful rates because volume was the only way to increase the odds of achieving even partial success. Some commanders requested permission to surface and engage targets with deck guns, preferring the certainty of gunfire over the lottery of torpedo attacks. These adaptations kept submarines in dangerous situations longer than proper doctrine recommended, extended their exposure to enemy counterattacks, and increased the likelihood that they wouldn't come back. USS Wahoo's aggressive tactics under Commander Dudley Morton produced some successes, but Morton's willingness to take extreme risks to overcome torpedo problems eventually got him killed when Wahoo was sunk in October 1943. How many other submarines went down fighting with inadequate weapons, and how many of those losses could have been prevented if the Mark 14 had simply worked as designed? By mid-1942, the psychological toll was evident in patrol reports and crew interviews. Submarine crews were losing confidence not just in their torpedoes, but in the institutional Navy that had sent them to war with broken weapons and seemed incapable of fixing the problem. They were discovering that perfect training and perfect execution meant nothing when the weapon itself was defective. They were learning that institutional inertia and bureaucratic face-saving could override tactical reality and empirical evidence. And they were realizing that the men making decisions about torpedo design and testing were insulated from the consequences of those decisions in ways that submarine crews would never be. The people who decided live-fire testing was too expensive weren't the ones watching enemy ships escape. The engineers who declared the Mark 14 combat-ready weren't the ones diving deep under depth-charge attacks after failed torpedo runs. The admirals who dismissed crew complaints weren't the ones counting down dwindling torpedo supplies knowing that each remaining shot probably wouldn't work. The cost of the Navy's decisions was being paid by men who had no voice in making those decisions and no power to change them. It took until September 1943 for the Navy to officially acknowledge all the major problems with the Mark 14 torpedo and implement comprehensive fixes. 21 months of war. 21 months of submarine crews fighting with weapons that didn't work while patrol reports documenting the failures piled up at Pearl Harbor and Washington. The magnetic exploder was finally deactivated after submariners conducted their own unauthorized tests, proving it was fundamentally flawed. The depth control problem was identified and corrected after more unauthorized testing revealed that torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their settings indicated. The contact exploder's firing pin was redesigned after yet more field testing showed it was too fragile to withstand the impact of hitting a target at the correct angle. Every single one of these problems could have been discovered and fixed before the war started if the Navy had conducted proper live-fire testing. Every single one of these problems was instead discovered in combat at the cost of missed opportunities, extended operations, increased risk, and lost lives. The official narrative eventually acknowledged the Mark 14's problems as a regrettable technical oversight, a case of peacetime assumptions failing to account for combat realities. This narrative is comfortable and contained. It suggests that mistakes were made, but lessons were learned, and the system ultimately corrected itself. It allows the Navy to file the Mark 14 failure under lessons learned and move forward without assigning blame or examining deeper institutional problems. But that narrative carefully avoids asking the questions that the documented evidence demands. The problems with the Mark 14 weren't unknown. They were documented in pre-war tests and reports. Officers raised concerns. Technical data showed inconsistencies and failures. The decision not to conduct comprehensive live-fire testing wasn't made in ignorance. It was made despite evidence suggesting such testing was necessary. So who made that decision? Who decided that saving money on test torpedoes was more important than verifying that the weapon worked? Who read the reports documenting problems and chose to proceed with production anyway? The files don't provide clear answers because the decision-making process was diffused across multiple levels of bureaucracy and institutional inertia. No single person decided to send submarines to war with defective torpedoes. Instead, Dozens of people made small decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation but accumulated into catastrophic failure. Budget officers decided that live-fire testing was too expensive given peacetime constraints. Engineers decided that theoretical calculations were sufficient to verify performance. Admirals decided that the strategic need for torpedo stockpiles outweighed concerns about incomplete testing. Each decision was defensible within its immediate context. Each decision-maker could point to institutional pressures and limited resources and competing priorities. But the aggregate effect of all these reasonable-sounding decisions was that American submarines went into World War II carrying a primary weapon that had never been proven to work, and when that weapon failed repeatedly in combat, the same institutional structure that created the problem proved incapable of rapidly fixing it. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Mark 14 failure is how long it took for the Navy to accept that the problem existed. Submarine commanders were reporting torpedo failures from the first weeks of the war. By early 1942, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone reading patrol reports. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance continued insisting that the Mark 14 was functioning properly, and that reported failures must be due to crew error or improper maintenance or unrealistic expectations. It took submariners conducting their own unauthorized tests and presenting irrefutable evidence before the Navy would officially acknowledge problems that had been obvious for more than a year. This wasn't scientific caution or proper skepticism. This was institutional resistance to admitting error, a bureaucratic immune response that prioritized protecting reputations and avoiding blame over fixing a weapon that wasn't working. How many other problems in military procurement and weapons development follow this same pattern? How many other systems go into combat with known flaws that everyone agrees to ignore until the body count gets high enough to force institutional acknowledgement? The Mark 14 torpedo story is usually told as a technical failure that was eventually overcome through American ingenuity and adaptability. That version is true, but incomplete. The deeper story is about institutional cultures that value theoretical perfection over empirical testing, that prioritize cost savings over verification, that resist acknowledging errors even when evidence becomes overwhelming. These are problems unique to the Mark 14 or to World War II. These are systemic patterns that repeat across different eras and different weapons systems whenever institutions convince themselves that proper testing is too expensive or too time-consuming or unnecessary because the engineering looks sound on paper. The men who went to war with defective Mark 14 torpedoes paid the price for decisions made years earlier by people who never had to face the consequences of those decisions. They fought with broken weapons while the people who broke those weapons continued their careers unbothered by the failures they had created. The files from Pearl Harbor contain thousands of pages of patrol reports documenting torpedo failures. They contain technical analyses of recovered duds. They contain correspondence between submarine commanders and Bureau of Ordnance officials arguing about whether the problems were real. They contain evidence of a systemic failure that extended the war and cost lives. What they don't contain is accountability. No one was court-martialed for sending submarines to war with defective torpedoes. No one was relieved of command for ignoring warnings about incomplete testing. No careers were ended because the Mark 14 failed for 21 months while institutional inertia prevented rapid fixes. The system that created the problem and then resisted fixing it remained intact, staffed by the same people making the same kind of decisions about the next generation of weapons. If the cost of failure is never paid by the people who create the failure, what incentive exists to prevent the next failure? And if this happened with something as critical as submarine torpedoes in the middle of a world war, what else happened that the files don't talk about?